Judge Fat shames old veteran. What happens next is shocking. The fluorescent lights of courtroom 302 buzzed overhead as Frank Turner adjusted his tie for the third time. At 65, his fingers weren't as nimble as they used to be, but some habits from his military days died hard. The wooden bench creaked under his weight as he shifted uncomfortably, waiting for his case to be called. 23 years in military investigation hadn't prepared him for this moment. Fighting for disability compensation after a service-related injury had left him with chronic pain and limited mobility. Case number 47852, Turner vs. Veterans Affairs Administration. The court clerk announced, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Frank pushed himself up slowly, his knees protesting with each movement. As he made his way to the plaintiff's table, he could feel the eyes of the scattered observers in the gallery following him. Among them sat Megan Carter, a young journalist from the local paper, who had come to observe what she thought would be routine court proceedings. She couldn't have known she was about to witness something that would change both their lives forever. Judge Maxwell Parker's entrance was preceded by the traditional, "All rise," but Frank's struggle to stand quickly caught the judge's attention. Parker's lips curled into a subtle smirk as he settled into his chair, his gaze fixed on Frank's substantial frame. Well, Parker drawled, letting his reading glasses slide down his nose as he examined the file before him. "Mr. Turner, I see you're seeking additional compensation for, what was it again? Inability to maintain physical fitness standards?" Frank cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my service-related injury has progressively worsened, affecting my ability to push away from the dinner table?" Parker interrupted, triggering a ripple of nervous laughter from the gallery. "I mean, looking at you, Mr. Turner, it seems you've been compensating quite well with extra portions." Frank's face flushed red, but years of military discipline kept him standing straight. "Sir, my weight gain was a direct result of reduced mobility after the injury I sustained during a classified operation in—" "Oh, classified!" Parker's voice dripped with sarcasm. "How convenient. Tell me, Mr. Turner, was it also classified how many donuts you had for breakfast this morning?" The laughter in the courtroom grew louder, more confident now that the judge had given them permission to be cruel. In the gallery, Megan Carter's hand tightened around her phone, her journalist's instincts telling her something was very wrong with this scene. "Your Honor," Frank's attorney attempted to intervene. "Mr. Turner's medical records clearly show—" "Show what?" Parker cut in again. "That the VA should fund his expanding waistline? I've seen enough of these cases, Mr. Turner. Veterans who let themselves go and then expect the taxpayers to foot the bill for their lack of self-control." Frank stood there, his face now a deep shade of crimson, as 23 years of decorated service were reduced to a cruel joke. His hands, which had once defused bombs and gathered intelligence that saved countless lives, now trembled slightly at his sides. "I served my country for over 2 decades, Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his years in service. "I was injured protecting classified information that saved American lives. And now you're injuring our healthcare system," Parker quipped, eliciting more laughter. "Tell me, when was the last time you could even see your feet?" In the gallery, Megan had already started recording on her phone, carefully hiding it beneath her notebook. Her blood boiled as she watched the judge continue his tirade, each jab more personal than the last. "I've seen veterans with missing limbs show more responsibility for their health," Parker continued, clearly enjoying his audience's reaction. "At least they have an excuse for their disability claims. What's yours, besides an obvious addiction to comfort food?" The courtroom had become a circus, with Parker as the ringmaster and Frank as the unwilling main attraction. Even the court officers were struggling to maintain their professional composure, some turning away to hide their smirks. "Your Honor," Frank's attorney tried one last time. "We have extensive medical documentation." "Save it." Parker waved his hand dismissively. "I've seen enough. Based on the evidence before me, or should I say, the evidence that's about to break that chair, I'm denying the petition for additional compensation." Frank stood perfectly still, his military training the only thing keeping him upright. In his mind, He was no longer in a courtroom but back in the field, enduring interrogation techniques designed to break him. The difference was, back then, he knew he was facing enemies. Here, he was facing an American judge, someone sworn to uphold justice. Furthermore, Parker added, shuffling his papers with an air of finality, I'm recommending a review of your existing benefits. Clearly, you have enough resources for excess consumption. Perhaps a reduction in benefits might encourage a healthier lifestyle. As Frank turned to leave, his movements measured and deliberate despite the pain shooting through his knee, Parker couldn't resist one final jab. And Mr. Turner? I'd take the stairs on your way out. Every little bit helps. The laughter followed Frank as he made his way back through the gallery. But one person wasn't laughing. Megan Carter sat stone-faced, her phone still recording, her jaw clenched in anger. As a journalist, she had witnessed countless court proceedings, but never had she seen such a blatant abuse of power and lack of basic human dignity. Frank pushed through the heavy courtroom doors, his face a mask of military stoicism. But Megan, who had been trained to observe the subtle details that made a story human, noticed the slight tremor in his hands and the way he blinked rapidly to hold back tears of humiliation. As the doors swung shut behind him, Megan looked down at her phone, reviewing the footage she had captured. In the background, she could still hear Parker joking with his clerk about needing to reinforce the courthouse chairs. Her finger hovered over the delete button for a moment before a sense of purpose crystallized in her mind. This wasn't just another day in court. This was the beginning of something much bigger than either she or Frank could imagine. Little did Judge Parker know, his moment of cruel entertainment would soon become the catalyst for his own downfall, and the security camera footage from that day would be played and replayed thousands of times across the nation. But for now, he simply moved on to his next case, unaware that his world was about to change forever, all because he chose the wrong veteran to humiliate. At 2 a.m., Megan Carter sat in her small apartment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The footage from Judge Parker's courtroom had been edited, not to alter content, but to ensure Frank Turner's dignity remained as intact as possible. She had titled it simply, Judge mocks disabled veteran, the face of American justice? Here goes everything, she whispered, clicking upload before she could second-guess herself. She hadn't slept since the court session, her journalist's ethics wrestling with her human outrage. In the end, the public's right to know had won out. By sunrise, her phone was buzzing incessantly. What started as a trickle quickly became a flood. Local veterans groups shared the video first, then national organizations picked it up. By noon, the footage had jumped platforms. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and even LinkedIn were ablaze with outrage. Hashtag Judge Parker Resign started trending. The comments poured in. This is how we treat our veterans. Disgusting. My father served 30 years. This makes me sick. Who gave this clown a gavel? Major news networks began calling Megan's editor. The young journalist found herself thrust into the spotlight, fielding interview requests from national morning shows. But her thoughts kept returning to Frank Turner, wondering how he was handling the sudden attention. She didn't have to wait long to find out. Her office phone rang around 3 p.m. Miss Carter? The voice was unmistakably Frank's. I believe we need to talk. They met at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. Frank sat in a corner booth, his military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. His hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. I didn't want this attention, he said quietly as Megan slid into the seat across from him. But I've received over 300 messages from other veterans. They all have stories, Miss Carter. Stories about Parker. Before Megan could respond, the diner's TV caught their attention. Judge Parker was holding a press conference outside the courthouse. My comments were simply light-hearted banter, Parker announced, his usual courtroom confidence somewhat diminished under the harsh glare of camera lights. Anyone who knows me knows I have the utmost respect for our veterans. This has been taken completely out of context. Frank's knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. Light-hearted banter? He muttered. The press wasn't buying Parker's explanation either. Questions flew. Do you regularly engage in lighthearted banter about disabilities? How many veteran cases have you presided over? Are you planning to apologize? Parker's dismissive wave only fueled the fire. I have nothing to apologize for. My record speaks for itself. It certainly did. Within hours, military organizations began digging into that record. The American Legion issued a scathing statement. The veterans of foreign wars called for an investigation into Parker's past rulings. Even active duty military officials began speaking out. Admiral James Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations, released a rare personal statement. The treatment of retired investigator Turner goes against everything we stand for as a nation that honors its veterans. This behavior is unacceptable from any official, let alone a judge. The story took another turn when Frank's military record, or at least the unclassified portions, became public. 23 years of distinguished service. Multiple commendations. Lives saved. Operations so successful they remained classified. The public image of an overweight veteran seeking handouts was replaced by the reality, a decorated hero who'd sacrificed his health in service to his country. Parker's position began to crumble. His courthouse was flooded with protesters. Veterans in wheelchairs lined the entrance. Former service members in full-dress uniforms stood silent vigil in the gallery during his sessions. The pressure was relentless. Local politicians, sensing the shifting winds, began distancing themselves. The mayor, who had appointed Parker, issued a carefully worded statement about reviewing all options. The State Bar Association announced an ethics inquiry. But it was the personal stories that truly turned the tide. Veterans began coming forward, sharing their experiences in Parker's courtroom. Each account added weight to the growing controversy. He told me my PTSD was just an excuse for being lazy, one former Marine wrote in a viral post. He suggested I was faking my war wounds, shared another veteran. He laughed when I explained my Gulf War syndrome symptoms, a third reported. Megan's phone rang again. This time it was her editor. Carter, this is bigger than we thought. We're giving you full resources. Follow this wherever it leads. She looked across the diner table at Frank, who was reading through more messages on his phone. Mr. Turner, she said, would you be willing to help me dig deeper? Frank's eyes met hers, and for the first time since the courtroom, she saw a spark of something besides pain. It was purpose. Miss Carter, he replied, his investigator's instincts clearly awakening. I think it's time we looked beyond just one bad day in court. Parker's record needs a proper review. As they left the diner, neither Frank nor Megan realized they were about to uncover something far more sinister than judicial misconduct. Parker's cruel jokes weren't just a character flaw, they were a symptom of a deeper corruption that had infected the entire system. Outside, more protesters had gathered at the courthouse. Signs read, "Justice for Veterans," and "Resign Parker." The judge's BMW slipped out the back entrance, but not before someone captured a photo of his obvious frustration. It went viral within minutes. That evening, as Megan prepared her next article and Frank began his own investigation, Judge Parker sat in his luxury home, watching his carefully constructed world start to unravel. His phone rang, a private number. "Handle it," a voice commanded before hanging up. Parker poured himself a drink, his hands shaking slightly. The public thought they knew the whole story. They had no idea what was really at stake. And neither did Frank Turner or Megan Carter, yet. Frank Turner's home office had transformed into an investigation headquarters overnight. Case files covered every surface, sticky notes created a complex web on his walls, and his old military laptop hummed continuously as he dug deeper into Judge Parker's history. 23 years of investigative experience had taught him one thing: patterns never lie. "Look at this," Frank called to Megan, who was sifting through court transcripts on his couch. He pointed to his computer screen, where he'd created a timeline of Parker's rulings. "Notice anything strange about these disability cases?" Megan leaned in, her journalist's eye scanning the data. "They're all dismissed within 15 minutes of starting. That's unusually fast." "Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. Frank pulled up another spreadsheet. Every case that got dismissed had one thing in common. The defendant was represented by Stellar Properties LLC. The real estate developer? Megan's eyebrows shot up. The one building those luxury condos downtown. Frank nodded, his investigator's instincts firing on all cylinders. I started calling some of the dismissed plaintiffs. 7 so far have mentioned being approached before their hearings with settlement offers, all from the same law firm representing Stellar Properties. As if on cue, Frank's phone buzzed. Another message from a former litigant. Mr. Turner, what you went through with Parker. Same thing happened to me. But there's more. Before my hearing, a man offered me $5,000 to drop the case. When I refused, Parker threw it out. Megan was already typing notes. We need to talk to these people in person. Get their stories on record. Over the next week, they conducted interviews in coffee shops, park benches, and quiet diners. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. Sarah Martinez, a whistleblower who tried to expose safety violations at a Stellar Properties construction site, described how Parker had not only dismissed her case but had her fined for wasting the court's time. James Wilson, a disabled veteran who'd lost his apartment to a questionable eviction, recalled seeing Parker having lunch with Stellar's CEO at an exclusive country club the day before his case was dismissed. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Linda Chin, a former clerk at Parker's court, reached out through a secure email. I saw things, her message read. Money changing hands in parking lots. Files disappearing from the system. But the real evidence is in the property records. Look at Parker's wife's name. Frank and Megan spent hours at the county records office. Hidden behind layers of shell companies and LLCs, they found it. Patricia Parker was the owner of 5 luxury properties, all purchased within days of her husband dismissing major cases involving Stellar Properties. The properties alone are worth millions, Megan whispered, her hands shaking as she photographed the documents. No judge's salary could explain this. Frank sat back, his military training kicking in. We're not just dealing with a cruel judge anymore. This is organized corruption. That night, as they reviewed their findings in Frank's office, an unmarked envelope appeared under his door. Inside was a USB drive and a note. Security footage from Stellar's office basement. Watch it alone. Be careful. The footage showed Parker in a private meeting room, accepting an envelope from Stellar's CEO. The audio was crystal clear. The veterans' cases are becoming a problem. Handle them like the others. This is bigger than we thought, Megan said, her voice tight with tension. It's not just about discrimination. They're systematically targeting veterans who speak up against Stellar's practices. Frank nodded grimly. Because veterans have credibility. If one of us exposes their safety violations or tenant abuse, people listen. So they needed a judge in their pocket to shut us down. More evidence poured in as word spread about their investigation. A former Stellar employee provided internal emails discussing judicial arrangements. A court reporter shared recordings of Parker's private chambers, where he openly discussed maintaining business relationships with developers. But the most damning evidence came from Parker's own financial records, obtained through a whistleblower at his bank. Monthly deposits to offshore accounts, all traced back to shell companies connected to Stellar Properties. We've got enough to expose him, Megan said, reviewing their evidence wall. We could go public right now. Frank shook his head, years of investigative experience guiding his decision. Not yet. If we move too soon, they'll have time to cover their tracks. We need something they can't deny. Something live. He turned to his computer, pulling up a property dispute he'd been monitoring. Look at this. Stellar's trying to evict a whole block of veterans from their apartments. The case is coming up next week. You're thinking what I think you're thinking? Megan asked, already seeing where this was going. We need to set a trap. Frank confirmed, his investigator's mind already formulating a plan. But we'll need help. Official help. That evening, Frank made a call to an old military contact now working at the FBI. As he outlined what they'd discovered, he could hear the agents typing in the background. "Send everything you have," the agent said. "And Turner? Watch your back. People like this don't go down easily." As if to confirm the warning, Frank noticed a black SUV parked outside his house that night, its engine running. When he took out his trash, the vehicle pulled away slowly, its tinted windows concealing the occupants. "They're watching us," he told Megan the next morning. "Which means we're close to something big. Close enough to get them nervous." She agreed, showing him her phone. Someone had tried to hack her email overnight. Frank looked at their evidence wall, at the faces of all the veterans who'd been denied justice. "Then let's give them something real to be nervous about." They spent the rest of the day planning their next move. If Parker and Stella wanted to play hardball, they were about to learn a lesson about messing with a military investigator. Frank might have been humiliated in that courtroom, but he was far from defeated. As night fell, Frank and Megan put the final touches on their plan. They had no idea that what they were about to uncover would shake the city's power structure to its core. The bait was set. Under the alias Marcus Stevens, Frank filed a property dispute case against Stellar Properties. The paperwork painted the perfect picture: a disabled veteran fighting eviction from a building Stellar had recently acquired. It was exactly the kind of case Parker couldn't resist dismissing. "Your wire is showing," Megan whispered, adjusting the hidden camera disguised as a button on Frank's jacket. They were in a bathroom at Morton's Steakhouse, an upscale restaurant where, according to their intelligence, Parker frequently met with Stellar's executives. "Remember," Frank said, checking his watch, "we need him to explicitly mention the case. Any ambiguity and he could wriggle out of this." Megan nodded, testing her own hidden camera embedded in a fashionable brooch. "The FBI's surveillance van is parked across the street. They're recording everything too." They'd chosen their timing carefully. According to the whistleblower from Stellar, Parker always met with developers on Tuesday evenings, away from the courthouse's prying eyes. Tonight was no different. Frank took his position at the bar, while Megan settled into a booth with a clear view of Parker's usual private room. Right on schedule, the judge arrived, followed 10 minutes later by Charles Winston, Stellar's CEO. Through their earpieces, they could hear the FBI agent's instructions. "Let them get comfortable. We need natural conversation." After ordering expensive whiskey, Parker and Winston began their meeting. Frank pretended to nurse his club soda, while Megan appeared engrossed in her phone. "This Stevens case." Parker's voice came through clearly on their wires. "It's similar to the Turner situation. Another veteran claiming wrongful eviction." Winston swirled his drink. "It needs to go away. We can't have these people interfering with our development plans." "My usual fee has gone up," Parker said, leaning back. "Recent publicity has made things complicated." "Name your price." "The penthouse in your new marina development. Plus the usual offshore arrangement." Winston didn't blink. "Done. As long as you keep these veterans in line." Frank's hands tightened around his glass. The casual way they discussed destroying people's lives made his blood boil, but years of undercover work helped him maintain his composure. The conversation continued, with Parker and Winston growing more candid as the alcohol flowed. They discussed previous cases they'd fixed, properties exchanged for favorable rulings, and their plans for expanding their operation. "Speaking of expansion," Winston said, pulling out his phone, "I've got something to show you. We're planning to acquire the entire Veterans Plaza complex. 300 units, prime location." Parker whistled low. "That's a lot of potential problems to manage. Which is why we need to discuss a more permanent arrangement." The FBI agent's voice crackled in their earpieces. "We've got enough. Move to phase 2. Frank stood up, deliberately stumbling slightly as he made his way to the restroom. As planned, he took the path that would lead him right past Parker's table. "Judge Parker?" Frank acted surprised, his voice carrying just the right mix of uncertainty and recognition. Parker looked up, annoyed at the interruption. Then his eyes widened as he recognized Frank, despite the weight loss and different clothing. "Mr. Turner." Parker's voice turned cold. This is a private meeting. Of course, I apologize, Frank said, adding a slight slur to his words. I've been meaning to talk to you about something. Winston started to stand, but Parker waved him back down. Make it quick. I know about Stephen's case, Frank said, leaning in conspiratorially. And I know about the others. Maybe we could come to an arrangement. Parker's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened around his glass. Are you trying to blackmail me, Mr. Turner? Blackmail? No. Frank laughed, playing his part perfectly. I'm offering to help. For the right price, of course. I have influence with the veteran community. Parker and Winston exchanged looks. This was exactly what they needed, someone to help manage the veteran problem from the inside. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private, Winston suggested, taking the bait. My office has a secure meeting room in the basement. Tomorrow evening? Frank suggested. I can bring some convincing evidence of my usefulness. Parker nodded slowly. 8 o'clock. Come alone. The next evening, Frank entered Stellar's headquarters wearing a new set of recording equipment. Megan was positioned across the street with the FBI team, monitoring everything. The basement meeting room was exactly as their whistleblower had described: soundproofed walls, no windows, and a false panel hiding a wall safe. Before we begin, Winston said, let's be clear about what's happening here. We're offering you a chance to be on the winning side. Parker, looking more relaxed in this secure setting, added, your military background could be very useful to us. Help us manage these veteran cases, and you'll be well compensated. How well? Frank asked, playing his role. Winston opened the wall safe, pulling out documents and photographs. Let me show you exactly how we operate. For the next hour, thinking they were recruiting an ally, Parker and Winston laid out their entire operation. They detailed the property schemes, the offshore accounts, the network of corrupt officials. Every word was captured on Frank's hidden cameras. And this is just the beginning, Parker boasted, pointing to plans for massive development projects. Once we clear out these remaining veteran properties, we'll control the entire downtown corridor. These people serve their country, Frank said, carefully managing his tone to sound curious rather than accusatory. They serve their purpose, Winston dismissed. Now it's time for progress. Are you in or out? Frank pretended to consider the offer. Just one question, what happens to those who don't cooperate? Parker's smile turned cold. Let's just say we have ways of making problems disappear. Permanent ways, if necessary. The threat was clear, and exactly what they needed. In their earpieces, the FBI agent's voice was triumphant. That's it. We've got them. But before Frank could make his exit, Winston's phone buzzed. His face changed as he read the message. There's just one problem, Mr. Turner, Winston said slowly, reaching into his desk drawer. We had you checked out. Marcus Stevens doesn't exist. Frank's hand moved imperceptibly toward the panic button in his pocket. The trap had worked almost too well. Now he just had to survive the next few minutes until the FBI team could reach him. The stakes had suddenly become life or death. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity. Judge Parker strode through the security checkpoint, nodding to the guards who'd long since stopped checking his credentials. In courtroom 302, his morning docket was routine: property disputes, small claims, and civil matters. He adjusted his robes, unaware that behind the gallery's double doors, FBI agents were quietly taking position. In the front row, Megan sat with her phone ready, determined not to miss a moment of what was about to unfold. All rise, the bailiff called out as Parker entered. The routine felt different today. There was a tension in the air that even Parker couldn't ignore. His eyes swept the gallery, noting an unusual number of unfamiliar faces. First case, Parker announced, trying to maintain his usual authoritative tone. Williams versus Metropolitan Housing. But before the parties could approach the bench, the double doors burst open. FBI agents flooded the courtroom, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Maxwell Parker, The lead agent's voice boomed through the suddenly silent room. "You're under arrest for bribery, corruption, and abuse of judicial authority." Parker's face drained of color. His hand reached for his gavel, as if that symbol of authority could somehow shield him from what was happening. "This is ridiculous. I am a sitting judge." "Not anymore," came a voice from the gallery. Frank Turner stood up, his military bearing more pronounced than ever. He'd lost weight since that first humiliating day in court, but gained something far more valuable: justice. The lead FBI agent approached the bench, handcuffs ready. "We have you on tape accepting bribes, conspiring to violate civil rights, and threatening witnesses. Would you like me to play the recordings here in your courtroom?" Parker's eyes darted to the exits, but agents covered every escape route. His carefully constructed world was crumbling in front of the very people he'd spent years intimidating. "I demand to speak to my attorney!" Parker shouted, his judicial demeanor cracking. "This is harassment!" The gallery had erupted into chaos. Court employees stood frozen at their desks, phones and tablets recording the unprecedented scene. Among the spectators, several familiar faces emerged: veterans whose cases Parker had dismissed, whistleblowers he'd silenced, families he'd forced from their homes. "Your Honor," the FBI agent said, the title dripping with irony. "Step down from the bench." When Parker hesitated, two agents moved to flank him. The same man who had mocked and belittled others now found himself being led down from his elevated position, his robes tangling around his legs. As the handcuffs clicked into place, a sound started in the back of the courtroom. Slow clapping. It spread through the gallery, growing into thunderous applause. People who had suffered under Parker's corruption stood up one by one, witnessing his fall. "This is all a mistake." Parker tried one last time, his voice having lost its commanding tone. "I have connections, I have." "Save it for your arraignment." The lead agent cut him off. "Your connections are being arrested as we speak." Across town, similar scenes were playing out. FBI teams were raiding Stellar Properties offices, confiscating computers and documents. Charles Winston was being led out of his luxury penthouse in handcuffs. The corrupt network was being dismantled piece by piece. Back in the courtroom, as Parker was led toward the doors, he locked eyes with Frank. The judge's face twisted with recognition and rage. "You did this," he snarled. "You and that journalist." Frank stood his ground. "No, Your Honor. You did this. Every time you took a bribe. Every time you mocked someone who served their country. Every time you chose money over justice." Megan's camera captured it all, the former judge being led through his own courtroom in handcuffs, his face a mask of defeat and fury. The image would soon be splashed across every news outlet in the country. The courthouse steps had become a media circus. Reporters shoved microphones toward Parker as the FBI led him to their waiting vehicle. The questions he'd dodged for weeks now followed him down the steps. "Judge Parker, how long have you been accepting bribes? How many veterans' lives did you destroy? What do you say to the families you evicted?" Parker kept his head down, but he couldn't hide from the justice he'd corrupted. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting his walk of shame live across the nation. Inside the courthouse, the chief judge called an emergency session. Within hours, Parker's cases were being reassigned, his office was being sealed as a crime scene, and his judicial license was suspended pending formal disbarment proceedings. Frank watched from the courthouse steps as the FBI vehicle carrying Parker disappeared around the corner. Beside him, Megan was already working on her story, her fingers flying over her phone's keyboard. "The same people who laughed at his jokes are running for cover now," she observed, showing Frank her screen. Social media was exploding with former courthouse employees and attorneys suddenly remembering instances of Parker's corruption they'd always meant to report. The FBI had set up a hotline for Parker's victims, and it was ringing nonstop. More witnesses were coming forward, each with their own story of corruption, each piece adding to the mountain of evidence. By sunset, the story had gone national. Cable news channels ran split-screen coverage. Parker's cruel mockery of Frank on one side, his arrest on the other. Legal experts dissected his career, finding patterns of corruption stretching back years. But it was the human stories that captured the nation's attention. Veterans who'd lost their homes due to Parker's corrupted rulings. Families who'd been forced out of their neighborhoods to make way for Stellar's developments. Whistleblowers whose lives had been ruined for trying to expose the truth. In his holding cell, Parker sat alone, his judicial robes replaced by an orange jumpsuit. The same security cameras that had once recorded his mockery of others now documented his fall from power. The man who had wielded authority so cruelly was learning a harsh lesson about justice. Outside the courthouse, a group of veterans had gathered spontaneously, some in wheelchairs, others standing proud in their service caps. They formed a line, standing at attention as FBI agents continued to carry out boxes of evidence. Frank joined them, falling naturally into formation. Together, they stood as witnesses to a different kind of victory, not one won on a battlefield, but in the halls of justice they'd sworn to protect. The day ended as it had begun, in courtroom 302. But now, Parker's chair sat empty, his gavel silent. On his desk, amid the scattered papers of his last cases, lay a small sign that had hung behind his bench. Justice must be served. Finally, it had been. 6 months after Parker's arrest, the federal courthouse was packed for his sentencing. Frank sat in the front row, watching the man who had once mocked him now standing before a different judge, awaiting his fate. Maxwell Parker, Judge Rodriguez's voice carried through the hushed courtroom. Your actions represent the gravest breach of judicial trust this court has ever witnessed. 20 years in federal prison, all assets forfeited, and permanent disbarment from legal practice. The sentence fell like a gavel strike. Parker, now gaunt and pale in his prison jumpsuit, showed no emotion as he was led away. His empire of corruption had crumbled completely. Stellar Properties was dissolved, their assets seized, and their executives facing similar sentences. Outside the courthouse, Frank faced a wall of reporters. No longer the humiliated veteran, he stood tall as the hero who had exposed systemic corruption. Mr. Turner, a reporter called out. How does it feel to see justice served? Before Frank could answer, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. Let me tell you how it feels. Admiral Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations, made his way forward. It feels like America remembering its promises to its veterans. The Admiral turned to Frank, extending his hand. Mr. Turner, on behalf of the military community, we have a proposition for you. We're establishing a new Veterans Advocacy Office, with full investigative powers. We need someone with your experience to lead it. Frank's eyes widened. After years of fighting for recognition, after being mocked and dismissed, here was an opportunity to make real change. I'd be honored, sir. But the day's surprises weren't over. Megan pushed through the crowd, waving a newspaper. Her exposé on the Parker scandal had just won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism. Look at this, she said, showing Frank the morning's headlines. Federal Task Force announces review of all Parker's cases. Justice Department pledges full investigation of veteran discrimination. The impact of their investigation rippled through the justice system. Hundreds of Parker's cases were being reopened. Veterans who had lost their homes were being compensated. Whistleblowers were being vindicated. The system that had failed them was finally being held accountable. That evening, Frank stood before a different kind of audience, a packed hall of veterans and their families. As he took the podium to accept his new role, he saw faces he recognized from Parker's courtroom, but they were different now. Hope had replaced despair. When I first walked into that courtroom, Frank began, his voice steady, I was a man who had lost faith in the system I'd spent my life defending. Judge Parker didn't just mock my weight or my disability. He mocked everything we fought for. He paused, looking at the faces before him. But today, I stand here to tell you that the system can work. Justice isn't just a word on a courthouse wall. It's something we have to fight for, sometimes in ways we never expected. From the back of the hall, a group of young veterans wheeled forward. They were residents of the housing complex that Stellar had tried to seize, now transformed into a dedicated veterans community center, funded by the seized assets of Parker's criminal enterprise. "Mr. Turner," one of them called out. "You showed us that one person can still make a difference." Frank smiled, remembering the dark days after his humiliation in court. "Not one person," he corrected. "All of us standing together." The ceremony concluded with a surprise announcement. The State Bar Association had created a new oversight committee, specifically focused on protecting veterans' rights in the legal system. They wanted Frank to chair it. Later that night, Frank and Megan sat in the same diner where their investigation had begun. But this time, they weren't planning a sting operation, they were celebrating victory. "You know what Parker said to me right before they took him away?" Megan asked, sliding a piece of apple pie across the table. "He said he never thought a fat old veteran could bring him down." Frank laughed, patting his now considerably trimmer stomach. "Guess he learned what military intelligence really means." On the diner's TV, news coverage continued to unfold. Parker's network of corruption had led investigators to similar schemes in other jurisdictions. What had started as one veteran's humiliation had exposed a nationwide pattern of judicial abuse. "So, what's next?" Megan asked, already sensing the answer in Frank's determined expression. "We've got work to do," he replied, pulling out a folder filled with case files. "There are other Parkers out there, other veterans being denied justice. But this time, we're ready for them." As they left the diner, Frank paused to look at his reflection in the window. The man who had stood humiliated in Parker's courtroom was gone. In his place stood someone stronger, not despite his struggles, but because of them. Across town, in a federal holding facility, Parker sat in his cell, watching his former courtroom being transformed on the evening news. The sign behind his old bench had been replaced with a new one. "Justice serves all who served." The final irony wasn't lost on anyone. The judge who had mocked a veteran's weight had ultimately been brought down by the very man he tried to humiliate. Parker's cruelty had not only ended his career, it had created a movement for change. Back in his new office at the Veterans Advocacy Center, Frank hung 2 items on his wall. The first was Megan's Pulitzer-winning article. The second was a simple photograph of Parker's courtroom, taken on that first day of humiliation. Under it, he placed a small plaque with words that would become his office's motto. "Justice weighs character, not appearance." As Frank settled into his chair, his phone buzzed with another message from a veteran seeking help. He smiled, reached for his reading glasses, and got to work. The story of one veteran's redemption had become a beacon of hope for countless others. The scales of justice had finally balanced.